to learn a little bit about you. This is autobiographical. And having learned a little bit about that, I noticed you really were good at tennis.
No.
In the 1964 time period, you know, I'm not that much younger than you. I remember guys like Rod Laver and Fred Stolle and all those Australians. And you were a tennis bum and good.
Yeah, but I was a decent high school tennis player, and you're naming names. I played Chuck McKinley back then.
Oh, now you're dropping
One
names.
time, and I won 2 or 3 points in 2 sets. And I'm not exact. I'd stand there, that ball would go past me. It was a different game. And then I went off to Trinity University, which was the top tennis team in the country at the time.
Yeah.
McKinley was still there, or just had left, and I couldn't play with those guys.
Yeah, well, Chuck McKinley.
Not even close. So
He was the #1 U.S. guy.
yeah, had won Wimbledon.
Yeah.
While he was at Trinity, they almost didn't let him go. At Trinity, he had to talk the president, letting him go because the NCAA men's was coming up, so he had to miss the NCAA men's so he could go off to Wimbledon. But he wins Wimbledon and does a great thing for Trinity. Anyway.
So during that time period, you kind of chose you weren't going to be a tennis superstar because of guys like Chuck McKinley.
Exactly.
And so, what was it at Trinity? You got exposed to Razzi?
Yeah. When I got to Trinity, a little bit of a long story. When I was graduating from high school, my father had died. It was an Air Force Reserve pilot called up for Korea, died in an airplane crash, training before he went off to Korea. And a friend of his followed me through high school and said to me, "You need to go off to one of the academies." So I applied to the Air Force Academy and the Naval Academy, got accepted to both. And in the middle of my senior year, I said, "I can't do this. I'm not doing this." Best decision I ever made, because I would have flunked out. I did not have the math skills. It was all engineering. And looking back on it, I clearly would have flunked out. College algebra showed me I would have flunked out. And so my stepdad says to me at the time, "Where are you going to go to college?" And I said, "I'll just stay here in El Paso and go to then Texas Western." And he said, "No, growing up is going away. And in September, you can be in a college out of El Paso, which I'll pay for, or you can be in an apartment anywhere you want to be, but you will not be in this house." And I said, "Oh, I get it." And so because I knew about Trinity, I said, "Well, I'll go to Trinity." And when I got to Trinity, they had compulsory Army ROTC for males. So then that's 64, so 66 pops in, and well, goodness, if you're going to go to war, if you're going to have to go in the Army, you might as well go as a lieutenant. So I stayed in ROTC.
Is there a background? Was your dad a military guy?
Oh yeah, he was. He was an Air Force Reserve pilot, and was killed on a training mission before he went off to Korea.
So there you are.
Trinity had been in World War II.
He at the very tail end, he goes into the Army, United States Army Air Corps, but the war ends before he gets into it, so he gets out, so stays a reservist.
So you're at Trinity, decide Razzi, if you're going to be in there, you might as well be all in. And did you kind of know what you were buying into?
You know, it's interesting. I don't know how many of you watched the Hemingway thing that they did on PBS. And you saw John McCain talking about reading For Whom the Bell Tolls and how it inspired him to do things. I could have sat with John McCain and said the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I almost teared up watching him do it, because that's what I had. I had the same romantic notion, manhood, prove yourself. And at the time I said to him, I said, well, because I kind of liked what I saw at summer camp. I liked the camaraderie. I liked all that stuff. And I said, well, that might be a good career. So I said, but if you're going to go in the Army, you might as well go. And if you're going to go off to war, why not go see what real war is about? So that's why I chose infantry. And back in those days, if you put an I anywhere on your your sheet that was letting you in, they said, that guy wants to be in the infantry. Because that's what they needed. Anyway, so I went off to infantry. Went off to Vietnam.
But during that time period, I mean, there was a lot going on in 1968, 69, just in the United States. How did you react to that? I mean, there was a lot of anti-war protests, et cetera. Did you kind of have a visceral reaction?
And Trinity University in San Antonio has always been accused of being in a bubble. And there's some real truth in that. I remember no protests at Trinity. I can only count on one hand the number of people I even knew that smoked marijuana back then. So the answer is no. But even then, I had no trouble with the Vietnam protesters, as I had no trouble with people who wanted to support Vietnam. It is decidedly, as this center so eloquently stands for, a nation of you can have your own opinion, and you ought to be able to voice that. So I had no issues with that. Yeah, that's the best way to say that.
So walk me a little bit through boot camp. You went to Fort Benning, did you originally?
Yeah, I went to Fort Benning, to infantry school, and then I got into Ranger School in January of '69. Went to Ranger School. I was in the last hard Ranger class.
Ah.
Yeah, that's what everybody says. I was in the last hard one. Wintertime, cold, nasty. Then I went to jump school. Went to a unit at Fort Hood for 4 months, and that was the way life was for infantrymen back then. They'd send you to a unit for 4 months just to get you into the real Army, and then they'd send you to Vietnam. So I was, by October, 1 year from almost the day I set foot at Fort Benning, I was landing in Vietnam.
While you were at Fort Hood, I'm reading something here that said, I went onto Fort Hood where there was a lot of sitting around in motor pools and a lot of unhappy people living in old barracks. It turned out to be a great research lab for how to deal with people. How so?
Well, that's, you had one of two types of soldiers in 1969 at Fort Hood, Texas, because we were not at that point bringing them back to the draftees, bringing them back to the United States and letting them leave the service at their point of embarkation back in the United States. So you had soldiers who had been to Vietnam and only had 2 or 3, 4 months to go in the Army to do their time. Mm-hmm. And then you had soldiers going to Vietnam who were as green as they could be. The guys who had been there, what are you going to do with them? You know, the joke was, what are you going to do, send me to Vietnam? I mean, and then the new ones, they were terrified about going, and nobody wanted to be there because almost all of them were draftees at that point. So it was an incubator for learning about people, and I think I'd started that in Ranger School. You really begin to see that in Ranger School. Ranger School is about as a leadership laboratory where they put you in these incredibly stressful, hard conditions, and you learn a lot about yourself. But you also have to lead your peers and get them to do things, and leading peers is often much harder than leading anybody else. So there was that kind of incubation period, and Fort Hood was a classic case of it. It was an interesting time. I'll tell you a quick story about Fort Hood and the old Army. People who talk to me about the old Army, I say, excuse me, I really don't know what you're talking about. I'll tell you 2 stories.
Sure.
I go, the first day I'm at Fort Hood, I walk in, I'm Second Lieutenant Hill, I'm sitting next to the first sergeant to show you things that you can remember and can't remember. First sergeant's name was Mahoy. He was a big, fat Hawaiian guy. And guy comes running in and he says, Top, Jones is up in the 2nd floor latrine and he's got a pistol. And the first sergeant of this unit opens his desk drawer, pulls out a .45, puts a magazine in it, chambers around, puts the hammer down, hands me this loaded .45. Lieutenant, come with me and do whatever I tell you to do. So I wander up into the latrine, and First Sergeant says, Jones, give me that pistol. Up yours, First Sergeant. Come on, Jones, give me that pistol. And it goes on for a few minutes, and he says to me, Lieutenant Hill, show Jones your pistol. Point your pistol at Jones. Cock the hammer. Jones, give me that pistol, or Lieutenant Hill is going to shoot you. And you're going, what? This is my first day in the real Army.
Oh, my God.
My first morning, the very next morning, I'm in I am in with the company commander. who
Assume,
is-
by the way, you got the pistol.
Oh, yeah, yes, we didn't shoot him. I hear somebody scream attention out in the order. I'm in the way with the company commander in his office. And in walks a major. I don't think I'd ever been close to a major except on on the stage teaching me things. And the guy's name was Bramlett. He was the XO of the battalion. I mean, of the battalion, excuse me.
Sure.
And he comes in, it's about 7 o'clock in the morning. He sits down in a chair right next to the company commander's desk. Company commander pulls out a desk drawer, brings out a bottle of bourbon, and pours this guy a glass about this tall, full of neat bourbon at 7 o'clock in the morning. At which point he picks it up. He pours him another one, at which point he picks it up. Puts it down. And every day I was in that unit, I watched that major jumpstart his day that way. That's reality, and that it's not what the military
Yeah.
is and grew to be.
Old Army.
Old Army, and that's exactly my point. Old Army.
So you're in Vietnam, and again, I'm reading from an article. This is called entitled "My War," James T. Hill. When I arrived at my unit at Camp Eagle, the first sergeant told me I'd be taking over a platoon in Alpha Company. The next morning, I climbed on a resupply bird and flew out to a one-ship landing zone in the jungle. A lieutenant named Jim Hill, Jim Hall, walked across Little LZ as they were kicking C rations and ammo out of the bird. He shook my hand and said, "It's a good platoon. Good luck." Then he climbed on his chopper and took off. I'm standing there in the middle of this LZ thinking, welcome to Vietnam. Not how I envisioned a change of command.
Exactly. In today's Army, my son went to Afghanistan. He is talking to the platoon guy that he's going to replace for a couple of months before they go. He flies over a month before his unit does. He rides around with this lieutenant, doing all the things the lieutenant's doing. Then his guys show up. They all ride around. It's called right seat ride. And after they're all comfortable, the old unit goes away and the new unit takes over. My right seat ride was a handshake. It's a good platoon. Good luck.
What were you feeling?
It was pretty terrifying. And a few minutes later, I'm probably standing there a couple of seconds, and I watch this guy. So we were way up in the mountains, this really dense jungle. And I walked over, and it's my platoon sergeant. A platoon sergeant's supposed to be an E7. Mine was an E5, just a three-striper guy. Really good platoon sergeant. And he says, "Let me introduce you to the platoon." And he introduced me to the platoon, and I've been there about 20 minutes, and he says, "Hey, Lieutenant Hill, second squad is going out on a patrol. Why don't you go with them?" And there I was, walking through the jungles.
Wow.
You come face to face with how to do things quickly,
Yeah.
or you fail.
Along the way, I mean, just recounting your career is in Vietnam is remarkable, but you actually were wounded a couple times.
Twice.
Purple Hearts.
Huh?
Can you talk about it?
Sure.
Yeah.
First time was a grenade. It landed right next to my left side. I can see all the stuff in slow motion. I watched it go up. I watched it go down. I kind of made half a turn, and then I ended up about 20 feet behind me. The concussion blew me back. It dismantled my M16. All I was left was handing the pistol grip. Tore all the clothes off my side, and everything but a few pieces just scratched me. The rest of it went away. And the next time was a claymore that killed. It went off about where you're sitting. It killed the first guy, the second guy. Did not kill me, killed the guy behind me.
Tripwire?
Yeah, tripwire. Yeah.
Did you get foxhole religion?
Foxhole religion. Well, I was raised in a religious household, Episcopal. I had a deep belief in God. At one point, I thought about being a minister. So I had that. I did wake up every morning Somebody talks to when people talk to you about bravery in battle, they're talking about or courage in battle. If they're honest with themselves, they're talking about what they can do that exact moment in time. They have no idea what's going to happen the next moment in time. And I remember waking up in the morning. I'm sure I didn't do it the first day or two, but there was somewhere in there I started saying a prayer, and I said it out loud every morning I woke up. And the prayer went simply, God, give me the same courage you gave me yesterday. And then I'd go about my business.
While there in Vietnam, you're, being in a leadership position, are you getting much information on what's going on elsewhere?
Oh, sure. You got we could listen to radios when we were back in the rear. We got the Stars and Stripes, little newspapers. You knew what was going on. Yeah.
Now, during that, there was probably about that time, the broadcasts were starting to be a little more critical of the war itself. Did that impact any of you at all?
I don't think so. I don't think we gave that much credit. I don't think we did that.
Yeah. So that wasn't a morale issue necessarily on the line? How did you find yourself growing? I mean, here you are in a leadership position and kept growing in that leadership positions. How did you get sense to your own character being molded as a result of this?
Oh, that's a good question. Nobody's ever asked me that question. It did. I got better at what I was doing, and you only do it by doing it. I don't know how to explain that. That's too hard, but I did.
Yeah.
Clearly did. I've said to people, the reason I came back from Vietnam and I stayed in the Army when I could have easily gotten out, I was a reserve commissioned officer when I went in. I applied for regular Army commission when I was at my first duty assignment, finishing my time. At the time, I was like 1 in 1,000 applicants that was accepted. And I remember, and as I've grown older and talked to people, I've said that I learned something about myself in the jungles of Vietnam. I learned two things. I learned that I loved what I was doing, not the war part of it, but the camaraderie, the leading, the soldiers, and I was good at it. I loved what I was doing, and I was good at it. So I stayed. And on the day I retired, with the Secretary of Defense, Don Rumsfeld, sitting there, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dick Meyer, sitting there, and the Chief of Staff of the Army sitting there, and a bunch of other people, I said that to that exact moment and to this moment, my greatest privilege and honor in life was leading American soldiers in combat in Vietnam. I'll go to my grave saying that.
Yeah. Obviously there was a lot of fatalities and mortalities, and well, that's war. I mean, that's war.
Mm-hmm.
And we've interviewed probably 300 World War II veterans as part of a process here, and you're confronted with that. And sometimes on the front line, and as you just spoke, you did it up close and personal. Doesn't make it any easier, but are you able at some point to mentally say, all right, we got to progress forward. This is a continuum. The next day will be the next day, as opposed to pausing and reflecting on what just happened the past day.
You can't do that and move on, in my mind, and move on. When we first went into Iraq the second time, Afghanistan and then Iraq, and right after I retired, I was mentoring generals as part of an Army program called the Battle Command Training Program. And I would be talking with colonels and lieutenant colonels, and we'd be talking about war. And I would say to them, this is a direct answer to your question, I would say to them, You guys have no idea, no concept of what your lieutenants and captains are going through. And there were lieutenants and captains who would hear me say this, and I could watch them nod because they knew it. I said, because you lieutenant colonels and colonels have never led a platoon or a company in direct combat. You have no concept. You can pretend to know, you can say you know, but until you've done it, until you've had a big fight, and there's some of the bad guys are dead over there, and 3 or 4 of your guys are dead over there, and you've put them into bags, and those bags have lifted off, and every soldier has seen himself in that bag. And they lift off, and you as the platoon leader say, put on your rucksacks, we're going that way. And I said, you've never done it, no fault of your own, it's the way the time. But you've got to understand that's a different kind of leaders, and you have no idea of the dynamic that's going on in that platoon and what's happening with it. Anyway.
In 75, Saigon Falls. You're in Fort Hood. You kind of watch it on TV, probably the last chapter. What was your feeling?
I think that there was some sadness that it ended the way it did. I don't recall really thinking my way through it. I don't remember any bitterness about why we screwed it up. I think I was just glad it was over. I knew that I wasn't going to have to go back again. And there was a good feeling about that too. So, yeah.
Did you watch Ken Burns' documentary?
Oh, every second of it. Yeah, thought it was spectacular.
So it rang true to you?
Oh yeah, and I loved and I've had friends of mine from that era say they didn't like it because it hoisted up the North Vietnamese too well. I disagree with that. There was 2 sides in that war, and I liked seeing the part where the North Vietnamese soldiers talking about what they did and how they reacted, what they thought. I refused to let my platoon, at least to my face, I'm sure they did it among themselves, but I didn't allow the word gook, any of the derogatory terms that we called the North, because even at that time and to this moment, if you dehumanize your enemy, you will end up dehumanizing yourself. And when that happens, bad things will happen, not may happen, will happen. And so I never looked at a dead Vietnamese soldier that I didn't see one of my own.
Right.
And I was glad to be standing up and watching him laying down, dead. But I worked real hard at that because soldiers had to go home. They had to look at themselves in the mirror 40 years from then. So you wanted to give them a good experience. And I think it worked out well. I had people keep up with me over the years. I had a soldier that I guess for close to 20 years, I'd get a phone call 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, really?
And every time it rang, like I'd say, pick it up, and I'd have to talk him off a ledge. He had fallen off the wagon, and literally a couple of times off a ledge. And he did that until the day he died. So he'd say, you kept me alive. I say, hey, Tom, come on, what are we talking about? About an hour and a half. So it's a troubling thing.
It's also a respect that you, as the commanding officer, that he had certainly for you, that as a leadership and then a skill set. So talk me through. You get done, you're back, Fort Hood. Kind of what are the next steps of?
Well, I get married.
Yep.
My wife and I got engaged when even before I went in the Army. And then we had one date, and I said, I got to cancel, so I got to go to Ranger School. And then right before going to Vietnam, she says, I'm not marrying you because I don't want to be a widow. But we got married right after I got back. And then I started doing the normal, applied for my RA commission, so I knew I was going to stay in. And I started doing the normal things. And then the Army started changing. The 70s, the mid to late 70s, a period I call the awful Army. You couldn't go into barracks at nighttime with if you were a sergeant that was in charge. If you had 4 or 5 AWOLs a week in your company, people came to you and said, man, you're a great leader. What are you doing right? In the 2 years I commanded my brigade, I had 2 AWOLs and 4,000 men in 2 years. We were talking about 4 or 5 a week in companies. It was incredible. So I decided to stay in, helped rebuild that army, and took it to the Desert Shield, Desert Storm, proved it to be a pretty good army.
Okay.
And I continued to grow, and people helped me along, and it was a remarkable time. My wife and I had a child. Child was born with multiple medical issues and cognitive issues. Megan was with us. She died at 2013 at 34 years old. So almost our whole military career, we had Megan. My wife did remarkable things for the Army in terms of making exceptional members better off than they were before. She helped write some of the regulations. She left the Army a whole lot better off than I did. She had real, we raised Megan along the way. Anyway, it was a wonderful life.
Last assignment, combatant commander, United States Southern Command, commanding all U.S. forces in Central and South America and the Caribbean. What did that really mean?
Well, one, it was a great job. It was a truly great job. In 1984, the Army, or the Congress, in their infinite wisdom, wrote the Goldwater-Nichols Defense Reform Act. I think that's exactly what the name was. Everybody just referred to it as Goldwater-Nichols. And they changed the structure of the Army, of the military, and they made it joint. And it was an incredible piece of work. Shows you what the Congress can really do when they pull together and work at it. Inconceivable that they could do it today, in my opinion. But they did it with a congressman from Alabama named Nichols and Barry Goldwater. And some incredibly bright people on the staffs. Anyway, the Army had been shown to be, the military in Grenada. In order to do Grenada, this little bitty operation, the first operation we did since Vietnam, in order to make it work, they had to draw a line down the middle of the island, put the Marine Corps over here and the Army over here, and they didn't talk to each other. And I was the aide to the Chief of Staff of the Army at the time, a guy named John Wickham, who's like a father to me, wonderful, great human being. And he said, you know, something's got to be better than this. But then the chiefs began to resist it because they saw their authority going away. Because what they said was, we need to put the guy who's in charge of the war in charge of the forces that come to him. And it can't be these guys over here in the joint staff sending us orders. And we need to make a guy in charge of Latin America, a guy in charge of the Pacific, a guy in charge of Europe. And if we go to war, that guy runs the war. And you, Chief of Staff of the Army, Chief of Naval Operations, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, your job is to raise the forces, train the forces, give them to the combatant commander to fight the war. Well, you say, what kind of war were you fighting in South America? I was fighting a drug war. I was helping Colombia survive as a nation. I was what I call a warrior diplomat. I went all over Latin America, moving United States foreign policy forward. And it was really a spectacular job. Not the least of which was my boss, Don Rumsfeld, and the chairman and all those, they were all concerned about Iraq and Afghanistan, and they left me alone. And it was terrific. In fact, I called up one day, Doug Feith, who was the policy guy. And I said, Doug, every day I get beat up in the Venezuelan press by Chavez, and they're calling me all these names, and I'm calling them names because that's what they are. Forgotten what I called Chavez, but it was like a demagogue. I forgot, doesn't make any difference. And I said, and it dawned on me that you've never told me what I should be doing about Venezuela. You've never given me any guidance. How am I supposed to handle this guy with Venezuela? It's coming up in the press all the time. And he said, well, that's a good point. I'll get back to you. Never heard another word from him, and I never asked another question.
You were in charge.
Ask for forgiveness. Yeah, exactly.
And I see a reference as part of that, part and parcel of that was peacekeeping duties in Haiti. You were, you had a peacekeeping force in Haiti, and a lot of things, including Deputy UN Commander Peacekeeping Force in Haiti. You read about what's going on with the assassination in Haiti today.
Yeah.
Do you have a reaction to all that?
Yeah, I do. When I went to the Joint Staff, as a result of Goldwater Nichols, let me jump back on Goldwater Nichols.
Sure.
As a result of Goldwater Nichols, one of the things it said to the U.S. military was, before you make a guy a general or an admiral, 1 star, he's got to have been in a joint environment. So what it said to the services, you better put your best and brightest in these joint jobs, because if they don't have them, you can't promote him to general, him or her to general. So it really put the thumb down on the services. It's what made it all work. So I am leaving. We've done Desert Shield, Desert Storm. I've been a brigade commander in combat with the same unit I was with in Vietnam, which is really remarkable. And I get assigned to the Joint Staff, and my title was Assistant Deputy Director for Politico-Military Affairs in the J5, Joint 5. And what that was I did policy work for the chairman in half the world. I had Europe and the former Soviet Union and the Western Hemisphere. And so I did Haiti in terms of trying to get the Haitians, because they'd had a coup down there. The military taken over Haiti. We're talking 1992, 3, right in there. And they'd taken over Haiti and had thrown President Aristide out. He had gone into exile in the United States. He was trying to, and when the Clinton administration came in, they really wanted to do something about Haiti, and they wanted to support Mr. Aristide. So I was doing policy work in that. And so then I leave that job, and I go be an assistant division commander, 1 star, in Hawaii with the 25th Division. And I've been there about 2 months, and we get orders that we're going to Haiti. And because we remember we had taken the 82nd and the 10th Mountain Division, and we had invaded Haiti, kicked out the coup people, the military junta, and then we ran Haiti they were running it for a couple of months. So we were going to be replacing them, the 25th Division. So we go over, and we're there for 3 or 4 months. It's a remarkable assignment dealing with the Haitians. I love the Haitian people. It's a country that will never achieve anything because there's no infrastructure, there's no industry, there's no way to create industry. They're burning down all the forests to make charcoal so they can eat. And at the same time, these people persevere, and they're the most resilient people I've ever been around. They're just incredible people. So I'm about ready to leave. And the Chief of Staff of the Army called me and said, I want you to stay in Haiti with the 3 star that I'm sending over there, 2 star at the time, 2 star, to be the UN guy. He's going to work for the UN. He's going to be the deputy. He's going to be the commander. You're going to be the deputy commander of the UN forces. And I remember saying to the Chief of Staff of the Army, well, can you describe what's a while? And there was this pause, and the chief says to me, he's a 4 star down to the little 1 star. He says, when I call you back. And hung up on me. So I stayed, and I'm only one of 3 that I know of, 3 U.S. Army generals that ever wear a blue beret working for the United Nations. A guy named Tom Montgomery, who was in Somalia, in the early days of Somalia, a long time ago. Joe Kinzer, who ran the force in Haiti, and me. And as I just said that, there's a 4th guy, and he wore it in Lebanon. And my brain's gone brain dead, but he went on to be a 4 star. He was a 1 star at the time. Anyway, so I stayed there and worked for the UN. That was a really nice thing. And then when I come back, and I'm now the 4-star in Haiti, in Southern Command, Haiti's running amok. And clearly the gangs are getting out of control. They're really having a hard time. And Mr. Aristide asks us to take him out, to save his life. And that's exactly what we did. And then we put in some Marines. In fact, I remember when Mr. Aristide flew out, it was on a Sunday morning, about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. I remember looking across at my deputy, and McChrystal, Stan McChrystal, was the 2-star running the operation at the time. And I said, you know what, I brought the guy, I was on the tarmac saluting Mr. Aristide when he came back as a 1-star. And I just shipped him out of the country for the last time as a 4-star.
Yeah.
It was full circle. But back to your question on the Haitians, on what's going on today, it's so sad. But I don't know there is no solution to Haiti. But what will happen if we're not really careful is they'll start these mass migrations again. And we'll lose boatloads of them, just like we did back in the 80s and 90s, and because they'll get desperate, and desperate people do desperate things, and they want to come to the United States. And I flippantly say the best thing we could do for Haiti is close it down, bring all the Haitians to the United States. They're great people. Every place that there's a large Haitian community, they're law-abiding, they're hardworking, they get all their kids in school, they really work at being good citizens. We'd all be better off and it'd be cheaper in the long run.
1-star to 4-star, you just talked about that. How does that work? Just in the process, I mean, you are a 4-star general. Folks back here, this is a big deal. This is a big deal. So how does that actually, how are you notified? How does that, I mean, it's like being knighted, you know?
Each service does a little bit differently. I'm going to talk for the Army. But they're all essentially the same. First off, you have to do every job you've ever done well. You've got to work at getting into the hard jobs. You've got to, what I say is, you've got to run the race all the time. You can't go sit down and take a nap. Other people are passing you by at that point. You've got to get lucky, and I can point to 3 or 4 things. In every profession anybody ever does, I'm describing everybody's profession.
Sure,
if you rise up to a high level of any kind, you had to work hard, you had to do hard jobs, and you had to have some luck along the way. I was heading off to a nothing battalion that I would never have made, would never have been a brigade commander had I gone to that training battalion. The numbers alone did it. A friend of mine bumps into me in the hallway and says, "Where are you going?" I hear you. And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, I'm leaving the aides job to the chief. He's retiring. How about I put you in the book and you try to be the aide to Chief of Staff of the Army?" And I said, "That'd be great, John." And I made it through that cut. I interviewed with General Wickham. He selected me as the aide. The first day on the thing, he says to me, "I hear you were going to this training battalion." I said, "I was, sir." "I am, sir." He says, "You pick the battalion you want to go to. You call over and tell them where you want to go." And I did that. I was blessed by him. He said to me again, the very first day I was the aide, he was the chief. He said, "You're here for substance, not form. You're not a bag carrier. You're not a gopher. You're here to learn how to do my job as a 4-star general. That's the kind of file you got. That's the potential you have. We know that. We're going to train you."
That's pretty heady stuff.
It was wonderful. I caught myself the first time I went to Japan as a 3-star. I'm standing they don't even have it now, the old grounds of Self-Defense Force headquarters down in the middle of Tokyo. And I'm standing on this little podium, and I'm getting the honors review that everybody gets when they show up, and I'm standing there in the national anthem's playing. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw my aide standing exactly where I stood when General Wickham stood on that little thing. It was so cool. But I watched him work. I learned what happens at this level. How do they make those decisions at that level? What are those different permutations? What are those competing forces? And I watched that and I learned from it. And then in that joint job was incredible. I was in and out of the White House 3 or 4 times a week in that job.
Yeah.
So you're learning how policy is made, and you're watching great leaders, the good ones and the bad ones. And in today's world, thank God there are more good ones than there are bad ones. And then you have to get the right job. In the Army, you've got to be a combat arms guy. So you have to be infantry, artillery, armor. Essentially, there's never been one that hasn't been. One of these days there will be, and that'll be okay. One of these days there'll be a woman. That's okay. You know, the U.S. military is, I say this all the time to anybody who listens, the U.S. military today is better because of women, not in spite of women. And anybody who says different isn't watching what's going on and isn't dealing with the bigger issues and watching staffs work. Anyway, so you work up, and then the law says, this is a long-winded answer,
Oh,
but
it's great.
the U.S. law says that, and so let's just take the Army. And let's say there's 400 generals in the Army. It's lower than that today, but let's use 400. 50% of those must be 1- and 2-star generals. Excuse me, 1-star generals. 50% must be 1-star. Of the following 50%, 35% must be 2 stars. So then there, 15% of them can be a 4-star, but it's got to be a 3 or 4 star. Excuse me, 3 or 4 star, and but it's got to be a specific place and a specific job. And you sign a contract that says, I accept the position of combatant commander of the United States, and I accept it for 3 years. And if I'm not offered another job at that rank or higher, there's no higher than a 4-star, but then I'll retire. So all 3 stars sign that. Otherwise, boards are picking you. Mm-hmm. They're picking you by branch because the Army only needs so many infantry people. It needs logistics people. And it's got them in these same numbers, and they are absolutely to the person held up by Congress. You can't have 401, you can have 400, period. So for another guy to go, some guy's got to walk out there.
Fascinating. So, retired Army General Tom Hill, the first military fellow at Harvard University's Institute of Politics. A first. You're first. How did that work? Did Harvard come to you and say you?
No, that was fun. That was such a great time. Right? I have a friend who is a brother to me. He and his wife, we met in 1976 and in Hawaii as captains, and we went 15 years together to the same places.
Oh.
Nobody does that. They're godparents to my son. We watched their children grow up, and they're family. I mean, they are simply family. Anyway, one of the younger son of this couple becomes a Democratic activist, and he's working on the Hill and working with the party and doing all kinds of stuff. And he rises up in that world and becomes, in the second, President Obama's second election run, he's like the number 4 guy on the election committee. He's in charge of all communications for the president. So when President Obama leaves, he becomes, anyway, one of the things he does, he's never made a dime in his life because he's been a political hack. And he says, I need to make some money and do something besides this stuff I've been doing for essentially nothing. So a friend of his, in fact, it wasn't a friend of his, it was, I think it was named the last Secretary of Defense who was from Harvard for President Obama. Terrible. I'll think of it in a second. Says, you need to go up to Harvard and do this job as an Institute of Politics thing. And so Brent goes up there. And we go visit Brent. And what a great deal. You're living right there in downtown Cambridge. You got this little apartment. You're dealing with all these incredible students. And I'm talking to the guy running the program, the staff guy, and then there's a woman who runs the whole thing. And they say, we've never had a military guy. Why don't you apply for this? And I said, well, that's a good idea. I'll think about that. So then my wife and I talked about it, and Tony said, 4 months up it was, so I applied. And there's a little bit of humility built into this too, because it's a student-run program. So you apply, and then you have to go up there and you get interviewed to see if they want you by 4 students. So the students decide if they want you or not, and it's a good deal because a couple of times they brought people in there who are just jerks. And don't really work with the students. But we got that, and it was absolutely one of the best things I've ever done. It was so much fun. And it was right during the 2016 presidential election,
Speaking of the
which was fascinating.
the 2016 presidential election, obviously there's a change in leadership, and you were interviewed shortly after General Mattis got the job of being.
SecDef.
Yep, and you had an opinion about that as to whether or not a military man should take such a position, and what was that?
I think that the SecDef ought to be a civilian. Military and civilians think differently. Lloyd Austin is doing a great job as SecDef, but Lloyd Austin can never be a civilian. He spent his life wearing a uniform. That made his brain work in a different way than the guy who rises up through business and politics and whatever. In my view, there's a healthy friction between the civilians and the military. It makes for good decision-making when it's a healthy friction. Having said that, I thought that Jim Mattis was a great SecDef, and I think maybe for President Trump, he was maybe the perfect one at that time. And Jim Kelly, too, when Jim Kelly was his chief of staff. But it really needs to be, it needs to be a separation of powers between the military and the civilian world. The military has become too politicized already. Anything we can do to stop the politicalization of the U.S. military, and especially the General Officer, Flag Officer Corps, is good. It's why I don't talk in public. I don't raise opinions. I don't think we ought to have opinions for the most part. We have opinions, but we shouldn't be out there trying to drive policy. And it does begin to pull us back into, we're like everyone else. And that's why I've thought over the last couple of weeks, we see these things coming out with the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Milley, some of the things he said. I just applaud what he's doing, and he's been so right in all of that. And that's what we just can't get into that. We have to have a military that the American people look at, and they know that U.S. military is never, ever, ever going to be part of a takeover of the United States. That isn't what the military's for. And anything that dampens that or makes us look sideways at that, in my opinion, is a bad deal.
There was a segment, and I'll date it as of December 2nd, 2016, so shortly after the election. And you're quoted as saying, "It's easier for a military guy to process a new president because the moment it happens, we switch allegiances because we've sworn our oath to the Constitution of the United States. So I try to remind everybody that he is, in fact, our president, and we need to support our president. That doesn't mean you have to buy into everything our president says, but you do need to support and work with him when you like what he's saying, and try to show a different path if you think there's another way of doing things." That still resonate today?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you had been at Cambridge on the Wednesday morning after President Trump was elected. I thought they were going to have to put Cambridge on a suicide watch. It was one of the saddest things I've ever done, because we all went down there, the mentors, and sat down in the room with these kids, and they were just absolutely crushed. It was the first time any of them had ever worked on a presidential campaign, for the most part. They had all, for the vast majority, had worked for Hillary Clinton and had gone out and done things, and they were absolutely crushed that she had lost. And that's when I reminded them of two things that morning. I reminded them it wasn't 1968. And anybody who ever lived through 1968 knows that the United States can live through anything. It was the closest until, except for the Civil War, where I think the country came so close to unraveling. And so I reminded them that and talked about that a little bit. And then I said, you salute. I take an oath to the Constitution of the United States. Unlike any other military in the world, we swear no allegiance to a president, a king, a prime minister. We swear an oath to the Constitution of the United States. And that means you're swearing an oath to the rule of law. That's what this place is all about. But I think that that's an important distinction. And I have been saying that for as long as I've been promoting people, as long as I can remember.
We talked a little bit about that while giving a quick tour of Jackson and his career in the law. And I just enjoy so much this opportunity, General. As you came down today here, and probably not knowing anything about us, but was there a certain question or two that you expected that I would ask that I really haven't yet, or that I probably should?
Well, I didn't think about it because I wasn't sure what the whole conversation was going to be about. No, I think that we've pretty much explored a whole lot of what I am. When I retired, I said to myself, when people of my ilk, when they retire, they do one of three things. They don't do anything. I know nobody who does that. They go to work for big industry, and I was offered a couple of things like that, but I was just tired of it. I didn't want to do that. Or they start a private, consulting thing, and they do their own thing, and that's what I elected to do. And I set three rules for myself. I never work for anybody I don't like personally, because the Army made me work for anybody. And there were a couple of times that was not what I liked. I don't work for anybody whose values aren't my values, and I want to make sure they're doing something that's useful, purposeful. I tried to lead a purposeful life. I tried to make a meaningful difference in somebody else's life, which is what I think life is all about. And I tried to do it honesty and with integrity. And I've tried to do the same thing since I retired.
Earlier, you said that the military is better because of the role of women in the military. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. There's several things that happen with women. They bring a different bias and a different operating style to the table. They negotiate differently than you and I negotiate. And it's because it's how they were raised in the world that they were raised in. And as a result of that, they focus, they make you, the male, look at things on a different level. One of the best women, to show you how far I go back with women in the military, when I was at Fort Benning in the advanced course as a captain, we still had the Women's Army Corps. We did not have, they were not integrated in the full force yet. And it was just about to happen. We're talking 1976, 77. And they brought 4 women to Fort Benning, Georgia, to the home of the infantry, and put these 4 whacks in the infantry officer advanced course. And they took as you can well imagine, a ton of grief, a lot of grief. But there was one of them, a woman named Pat Hickerson, whom I befriended. And I pushed back on some of my peers, but I befriended Pat. She retired as a 2-star. We remained friends, but she was a first of her kind in everything that she did, and she was a remarkable woman. But I watched Pat operate in ways that she just brought us something different to the table, and that's really what I get at. And in the U.S. military in particular, we're not, the whole country's not, we're defending the nation. The nation is made up of men and women. They ought to have the same ability to do all that. And they've been remarkable. My first exec, when I went to Miami and Southcom, ended up being the first woman West Point graduate to make Brigadier General. She was the second woman selected Brigadier General, but she was the first West Point person. And
Pat Foote the first? Did you ever meet Pat Foote?
No, I don't remember.
Evelyn Pat Foote.
I know that name.
Yeah.
But I think that she came up in a different crowd. I mean, it was a different way of promoting, but under the new system, when they're all integrated into the system, I've forgotten who the first woman was, but the first West Pointer was in the second, that's not the way to say it. She was in the second class of West Pointers, so she's the first
Pat
West
wasn't
Point.
West Point.
Yeah, she was the first West Pointer to be selected Brigadier General from the second class of women. And she's about this tall. And until she got hurt, you wouldn't want to run with her. She was one of the best battalion commanders I ever saw. We went to the Joint Readiness Training Center when I was a 2-star, and she was commanding her battalion. And the first morning we'd been there, they landed at midnight, and they had to set up their logistic base. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, so they'd been on the ground 6 hours. The head observer controller, the head of all the graders of them, I put out a net call, and he said, everybody, all you graders, go by and look at the logistics area, because it's the standard by which we will grade all of them from now on. And she went, and she rose up and did lots of different things, but she was she's one of the best officers I was ever around. I don't care what gender. She was just terrific. But does that answer your question a little bit? I just, it's just, it helps tone things down sometimes. You don't get into mine's bigger than yours. They can get us into that thing, and that's useful. It's very useful.
Tom, how has it worked out in places like Iraq in actual combat with women in the platoon level? Is that a problem at all?
I have not seen it in Iraq, but I'll give you a couple examples of that. I had a soldier, she's the wife of a 3-star now who will make 4 stars. And she was a West Point graduate. I had 2 couples when I went to Desert Shield, Desert Storm. All of them West Pointers, had all met at West Point, married out of West Point. 2 of my 2 infantry guys, and Patty was one MI person, and she was on my staff, intel person. She was on my staff, and the other one was one of my MP platoon leaders. So I called the 4 of them in together, and I said, okay, have you guys talked about what happens if one of you dies? Because I'm not losing 2 officers after I lose 1. They said, well, we haven't thought about that. I said, go off and think about that. Come back and let's talk about that. Because it was really the first time we'd had women in combat, and we were working our way through that Desert Shield, Desert Storm, because we didn't know what to do with them. For example, they weren't supposed to go in and be on the ground in a ground fight. Patty Alt was her name, but now it's Patty George. Patty George landed on the first helicopter that landed in my brigade command area at H+20 seconds of the fight. She was on one of the lead helicopters. The lead helicopter that flew in was flown by a woman. She was not allowed, that woman, to fly an attack helicopter but she could fly a utility helicopter, and she flew the first, was a Black Hawk. Patty, and I had a reporter with me who said she had really put him through his paces because he was on the same helicopter with her. And I was not allowed to take the MP platoon leader. She had to give up her position. Now, she would be, allowed to do it. The women who went through Ranger School the first time, they did everything the Rangers did. One of them had to do it essentially twice because she kept hurting and kept going back and forth. I got all the respect in the world for that. Part of in that era when was having this, I would say to people, look, it's not only 1 out of 25, however many women can physically do that, but if they can physically do that, then they ought to be allowed to try to do that, just like all the men. This whole business about, well, they can't be in the infantry because somebody's wounded. They can't pick up the 200-pound man and lug him 100 yards. Most men can't do that. Don't give me that crap. You don't pick them up on your shoulder. You drag them along because you can't pick them up on your shoulders. I think my son, I'll go back and answer better. My son goes off to Afghanistan, and he's a transportation platoon leader. He leads all the big convoys in from Pakistan into Iraq. I had a friend tell me who'd been in Afghanistan, he said, my son had probably one of the most dangerous jobs in all of Afghanistan. Not only because of the roads, because people were trying to kill him. His platoon was about 100 people, 70% women. I said, Griffin, who does your security? He says, Dad, we do. I said, well, who does all your planning? He said, Dad, we do. And I was having a discussion with a very senior guy who wanted to talk to me about just doing bodily functions. And I said to him, he was a helicopter, I said, how did you do your bodily function when you were flying your helicopter? And he said, well, it was difficult. I said, women do the same thing, it's just it's harder. I said, my son never stopped his convoy so that some woman soldier could go off to the bathroom, urinate. She did it in a cup, just like he did it in a cup, except she had to be more agile than he was. And Griffin talks about, he said, I'm driving along one day and this massive IED blows up, and he said, I watched the MRAP go up in front of me and come down. And I go running down there, open up the door, and he says, the sergeant inside, she was screaming, just mad as hell that her equipment had been up. All three of them were doing different, all three of the people in there were women. And my son says, when we were going through the gay thing, he says, none of us today care about this. I don't care if the soldier's gay or straight. I just care if he's a good soldier. Mm-hmm. And they've gotten that way in with women, and the women are accordingly. It's a different world, and it's a better world. It's a better army. Just better army.
This is fabulous. You've been very gracious with your time, and I'm sure the folks who will be watching this in the not too distant future will be thrilled to have. Is there a legacy in all of this? I mean, for you, as you reflect back on your military career, and as you speak and you say, I'd really like folks to kind of remember me in this way.
I'll tell you how I'd like to be remembered. I got a note the other day from a guy. I have no idea who this man is. He says, sir, I was in your brigade in Desert Shield, Desert Storm. I flew one of your helicopters. And the other day, the crew got together for a reunion. We hadn't been to for 30 years. And he said, and we spent a lot of time talking about your leadership and what you did. And he said, I left the Army after 5 years. I was always going to be a lawyer. And he said, what you taught me and taught us has helped me as a father, a husband, a lawyer, and there was a fourth term in there. I could barely get through it. And he said, I just wanted to thank you for that. And I'm thinking to myself, I wrote him back a note, and I said, I hope that someday someone writes you a note like that and says that you made that kind of difference in their life. Because that's really what it's all about, is making a meaningful difference in someone else's life. And it was one of those, it was really a nice feeling. So if there's a legacy in that, that's what I'd want to do. And I'd also say this, and I'd be remiss not saying this. I mentioned Tony earlier, my wife, and our daughter. Megan should have died countless times. Tony kept Megan alive. A lot of people push exceptional children off to the side and they don't do much with them. We decided early on that Megan was going to be a part of our lives. We weren't going to be a part of hers. We took Megan to everything. I mean, everything. She was at parades. She was at retirements. She was everywhere. And Megan touched a lot of people. I know of 4 people who sat with our daughter as babysitters who went on to get PhDs in handicap services, or I'm using the wrong term, but they got degrees in special education. And what my wife did in terms of setting examples for other people and leading other women who had that same kind of issue, it was pretty remarkable. And what she did in the early days, General Wickham, I keep going back to General Wickham, he's just such a remarkable, transcendent figure to me. But he decided he was going to do, he knew he only could do a couple, he's going to be Chief of Staff of the Army for 4 years. You don't get a second, you don't get 5 or 6 or a second run, you do it for 4 years. And there's only 3 or 4 things in that 4 years that you can really get done to leave a lasting stamp on the military. And what General Wickham wanted to do was he wanted to improve the lot of the family. He wanted to, of the children, of the spouses, the entire Army family, and raise them up and get them in a better field. Tony began working with him on helping write the Exceptional Family Member Program. She helped write the regulations. She has done things at every post we were at from the time I was a major until the time I retired. And that is a legacy. I think that we've helped people along the way. Not just me, but Tony and for sure Megan. Yeah. And the legacy, I've got a son who's a major. Yeah. So.
Salute you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Enjoyed
much.
the time.